Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinatha Shai Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan Ki Jai. Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Mayapur Dham Ki Jai. Jagannath Puri Ki Jai. Jamuna Mai Ganga Mai Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Tulsi Maharani Ki Jai. Samaveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prashtaya Bhutle Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Devi Guruvani Pracharine. Nirvishesha Sunyavari Paschatya Deshatarine. Today we're continuing the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita. And the only other book that we're taking excerpts from today is a book that Srila Prabhupada began translating in 1967, and that was Narada Bhakti Sutra. We'll hear about how that happened and how the devotees found that book even in America. So we're on volume 2 now, Breaking Ground. This is a picture of Brahmananda. At that time was Bruce Scharf. He had been studying Indian philosophy in college. He did his dissertation on the Bhagavad Gita. He had visited India, and now having come back, one of his friends told him about the swami down on the Lower East Side, Bruce. I decided to go and speak personally to Swamiji, so I went to the storefront. I found out that he lived in an apartment in the rear building. A boy told me the number and said I could just go and speak with the Swami. He said, yes, just go. So I walked through the storefront, and there was a little courtyard where some plants were growing. Usually in New York, there is no courtyard, nothing green, but this was very attractive. And in that courtyard was a boy typing at a picnic table, and he looked very spiritual and dedicated. I hurried upstairs and rang the bell for apartment number 2C. After a little while, the door opened, and it was the Swami. Yes, he said, and I said, I would like to speak with you. So New York is so developed with concrete and asphalt and buildings that you practically don't see any greenery anywhere. Sometimes you'll see some grass growing in between the cement on the pavement. Other than that, very little greenery. They have, because everything is designed in squares, every few blocks they'll have a little square that's a park, just like Tompkins Square Park, Washington Square Park. So it's all these squares. Everything is squared off because it's designed that way. So Bruce, he wanted to meet Prabhupada. He wanted to get to know Prabhupada and also explain his life to Prabhupada to see whether this was the right person that he could take shelter of. He opened the door wider and stepped back and said, yes, come. We went inside together into his sitting room and sat down facing each other. He sat behind his metal trunk desk on a very thin mat, which was covered with a woolen blanket-like cover that had frazzled ends and elephants decorating it. He asked me my name, and I told him it was Bruce. And then he remarked, in India during the British period, there was one Lord Bruce. And he said something about Lord Bruce being a general and engaging in some campaigns. So when Prabhupada was born, Lord Bruce was the Viceroy and Governor General of India, just as his father had been. So he was following in those footsteps from 1894 to 1899. So Prabhupada was born in 1896. So that's why Prabhupada was aware of Lord Bruce. He said, India is the pivot of our empire, the British Empire, because at that time there was a saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because the British had made so many colonies all over the world that anywhere you went, anywhere the sun was going, there was a colony of the British Empire. But according to Lord Bruce, India was the most important of all the colonies. If the empire loses any other part of its dominion, we can survive. But if we lose India, the sun of our empire will have set. Because everyone, all the European countries, they were trying to find India. India was so wealthy at that time, during the colonial periods from the 1400s on till the 1800s. India was the jewel of Asia. It had so much wealth. But then when it became colonized and overrun by conquerors such as the Mughals and then the British, it lost its wealth because they ravaged everything from India. They took the wealth out of India to their own countries. During his time as Viceroy, famine broke out in India, in which Elgin reportedly admitted that up to 4.5 million people died. Other estimates have put the death toll at 11 million people. So these were artificial famines that were created by the British because they were taking all of the rice and all of the cotton and the salt, everything that had wealth, anything that had any value, they were taking out of India back to England and stockpiling it there. Or they would put such heavy taxes on different commodities and force the people to buy it back from them at very high prices. So the people, although they were working, they were producing all these things, they were starving to death because the English were taking so much out of the country. I felt that I had to talk to the Swami, to tell him my story, and I actually found him interested to listen. It was very intimate, sitting with him in his apartment, and he was actually wanting to hear about me. While we were talking, he looked up past me, high up on the wall behind me, and he was talking about Lord Chaitanya. The way he looked up, he was obviously looking at some picture or something, but with an expression of deep love in his eyes. I turned around to see what made him look like that. Then I saw the picture in the brown frame, Lord Chaitanya dancing in kirtan. So the apartment that Srila Prabhupada had rented, on the street front was the 26 Second Avenue store, the Matchless Gift Shop, which was one room and a small toilet room, no bath or anything. Then there was a back door and you walked into a courtyard, which was very rare, as Bruce said, to have any greenery in New York. And then behind that courtyard was an apartment building. So Prabhupada's apartment, 2C, had absolutely no furniture in it whatsoever. He had his little trunk, a metal trunk, like you get here in India, where he brought his books and his own personal belongings. He used that as his desk. He had his typewriter on top of it. And then he had a little asan with the pillow behind him. And he would sleep at that place also. And then in the larger room, because that was a little side room, in the larger room, no furniture, just one little table. And on that table, Prabhupada made an altar with the picture that he had brought with him from India of the Panchatattva. Inevitably, meeting with Prabhupada meant a philosophical discussion. So now we're switching over to another young man who came to meet Srila Prabhupada, and this is Chuck. That's Charles Barnett. He became Achyutananda Swami. So both Brahmananda, Bruce, and Chuck, later they took sannyas from Srila Prabhupada and did extensive preaching here in India, and especially Brahmananda. Brahmananda was sent to Africa. He began the temples in Africa as well. So Chuck said, I asked him, can you teach me Raja Yoga? Oh, he said, here is Bhagavad Gita. He handed me a copy of the Gita. Turn to the last verse of the 6th chapter. So this is the last verse of the 6th chapter. Yoginam api sarvesham madgaten antar atmana shadavan bhajate yomam same yuktatamo mataha. And of all yogis, the one who, with great faith, who always abides in me, thinks of me within himself, and renders transcendental loving service to me. He is the most intimately united with me in yoga, and is the highest of all. That is my opinion. So this is Krishna speaking about Raja Yoga. What is the highest form of yoga? And read. Prabhupada told him to read this sloka. I read the translation out loud. And of all yogis, he who is worshipping me with faith and devotion, I consider to be the best. I could not comprehend what faith and devotion meant. So I said, sometimes I'm getting some light in my forehead, because I had no understanding that God was a person who you could devote yourself to, who you could serve, who you could have faith in, because all of the previous swamis and the books that Bruce had read were all impersonal, where they described God as an energy, and Krishna, when this energy wanted to manifest in the world, he came in a material body just like ours, and Krishna's body was just like our body. So when Bruce told Prabhupada about the light in his forehead, Prabhupada said, that is hallucination. Now, why hallucination? Because all these young boys were taking intoxication, and they were having these hallucinatory experiences while they were intoxicated. So abruptly he said it, although he did not strain his person. The words came at me so intensely that it completely shocked me. Raja means king, king yoga, he said. But this is emperor yoga. That's this sloka, emperor yoga, Prabhupada called it. So this is Chuck continuing to speak. I knew that he had attained such a high state, not by using chemicals from a laboratory. Those were the intoxications they were taking, like LSD, which was an acid that affected the brain and opened up all these hallucinations in the brain, or by any Western speculative process. And this was certainly what I wanted. Are you giving classes? I asked. He said, yes. If you come at 6 a.m, I am giving classes in the Gita, and bring some flower or fruit for the deity. That we used to have a rule, because when Prabhupada translated the Nectar of Devotion, it stated there that one should never go empty-handed to a temple. So whenever we would visit the temple, we would make sure, even if you just bring a little leaf, anything, and you offer that to Krishna. So Prabhupada was teaching that very early, that don't come empty-handed when you come to the temple. Bring something for Krishna. I looked into the adjoining room, which was bare with a wooden parquet floor, bare walls, and a tiny table. And on the table was a picture of 5 human-like figures with their arms raised above their heads. Somehow their arms and faces were not like any mortal that I had ever seen. Yes, because they weren't mortals. This was the Panchatattva, the Lord appearing in 5 different features. as his incarnation, as his energy, as his devotee, as his first expansion. So sometimes we heard even that sometimes the early devotees thought that these were women, and Prabhupada had to correct them. So that no one understood who Panchatattva was at that time, but they did get the opportunity to hear from Prabhupada, and soon after this, Prabhupada would begin giving the classes from the Chaitanya Charitamrita, which later became one of the first books called The Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, a very interesting book that describes the detailed difference between Mayavad philosophy and Vaishnava philosophy. It's the conversations between Sanatana Goswami and Lord Chaitanya, and then Ramananda Roy and Lord Chaitanya, where Lord Chaitanya asks different questions to Ramananda Roy. So very early, Prabhupada began giving the highest philosophy to these young boys in the form of teachings of Lord Chaitanya. I knew that the picture was looking at me. When I came out on the street in front of the storefront there were a few people standing around, and I said, "I don't think I'm going to take LSD anymore." I said it out loud to myself, but some other people heard me. So at this time, Chuck was only 18 years old, just a young boy. Many of us joined when we were teenagers like that. And because of the culture at that time, so many of the young boys and girls in high school, 18 years, beginning 16 years even, they would take this LSD. Some would take it for spiritual experiences, and some would just take it for intoxication purposes. So Chuck had been taking LSD, and now that he had met Srila Prabhupada, and he asked many questions to Srila Prabhupada because he had been studying Bhagavad Gita and practicing Hatha Yoga since he was 12 years old. So he had many questions, and Prabhupada was able to answer all of his questions. So he realized there was no more purpose for him to take intoxication for some spiritual experience. Now he was getting the real knowledge and the real mystical experience directly from a genuine spiritual master. Now Steve is Satsrup Das Goswami, another early disciple, one of the first disciples who also took sannyas from Srila Prabhupada, 1972. And we heard about his life last week, how he was convinced to go into the Navy for 2 years. As soon as he got out of the Navy, he didn't even go to see his family. He immediately went to the Lower East Side where all the young people lived, and he was fortunate enough to meet Srila Prabhupada. I wanted to show my appreciation for spiritual India, so I presented to Swamiji that I had read the autobiography of Gandhi. "It was glorious," I said. Prabhupada, "What is glorious about it?" Swamiji challenged. When he asked this, there were others present in the room. Although I was a guest, he had no qualms about challenging me for having said something foolish. I searched through my remembrances of Gandhi's autobiography to answer his challenging question, "What is glorious?" I began to relate that one time Gandhi, as a child, although raised as a vegetarian, was induced by some of his friends to eat meat, and that night he felt that a lamb was howling in his belly. Swamiji dismissed this at once, saying, "Most of India is vegetarian." Now at that time, more than 80% of the population in India was still strictly vegetarian. It wasn't until just about this time, we'll read about it later, around 1967, Indira Gandhi gave permission for the first slaughterhouses to be opened in Tamil Nadu. And this created great riots all over India. And never before was cow slaughter allowed. The killing of goats was allowed because that was part of the Kali Puja, but never had cows been allowed to be slaughtered before Indira Gandhi made it legal. And it caused a great uproar within the country. I couldn't think of anything else glorious to say, and Swamiji said, his autobiography is called Experiments with Truth, but that is not the nature of truth. It is not to be found by someone's experimenting. Truth is always truth. So in the Vedas, anyone who wants to understand the absolute truth it's called anukirtaya. That means you have to follow one who is speaking the truth. And that the person who's speaking the truth is the guru, and he only speaks according to what's written in the Vedic literatures. It's not that one has to experiment to find out what the truth is. The truth is already given to us in the Vedic literatures, and we have to have a teacher who can teach us those truths. We don't have to use our speculative investigation to find out what the truth is. We simply have to follow what is being spoken directly from the Vedic scriptures. So this is why Srila Prabhupada rejected the very title of the book, of the autobiography of Mahatma Gandhi, the story of my experiments with truth. We don't have to experiment. Just as in the Vedas it says that the conch shell is pure, although the conch shell is a bone of an animal, and bones are impure by nature, but the conch shell is considered to be pure. Also cow dung. Any type of stool is considered impure, but according to the Vedas, cow dung or gobar can purify a place. So these things can't be, now the scientists are experimenting, finding out that yes, cow dung has antiseptic, antibiotic properties. But if we simply read it in the Vedas, accept it as truth, then we use it and we find out that yes, this is absolutely correct. We don't have to experiment. Although it was a blow to my ego, being exposed and defeated by Swamiji seemed to be a gain for me. I wanted to bring before him many different things for his judgment, just to see what he had to say about them. I showed him the paperback edition of the Bhagavad Gita that I was reading and carrying in my back pocket. So at this time in the 60s, there were already over 600 English translations of the Bhagavad Gita. And we used to read the Bhagavad Gita, but none of the translations presented Krishna as a person, as a supreme personality of Godhead, that he can be worshipped, that he can be served with devotion. It was translations, but in a Mayavad or in an impersonal interpretation. So though we were reading Bhagavad Gita, as Steve had, he even carried it with him in his back pocket, we were reading it but not understanding Bhagavad Gita properly. They were removing Krishna from the Bhagavad Gita, actually. He perused the back cover. There was a reference to the eternal faith of the Hindus. So you see in this particular edition, the holy book of Hindus. And Swamiji began to take the phrase apart. He explained how the word Hindu was a misnomer. It means there is no such word as Hindu anywhere in the Vedic Shastras, and does not occur anywhere in the Sanskrit literature itself. He also explained that Hinduism and Hindu beliefs were not eternal. So where did this word Hindu come from? Well, when the Afghanistan came to attack India, there's the Sindhu River. So in the Arabic language, they don't pronounce S. S is pronounced as H. So just as in Bengali, in English we will say parikshit, correct? But in Bengali they just say parikit. They don't pronounce the S. So similarly, in the Arabic and the Urdu languages, they don't pronounce the S. So anyone who lived on the eastern side of the Sindhu River, they were called Hindus. So that's where the expression came, because anyone on the eastern side of the Sindhu River, they were following Sanatan Dharma, the Vedic Shastras, and because they didn't know what the Vedic Shastras were, they just referred to them geographically as the Hindus. So that's where the word came from. Now we're coming again to Bruce's conversations with Prabhupada. After I talked about my desire for religious life, I began telling him about a conflict I had with one of my professors in English literature. He was a Freudian, so he would explain the characters in all of the novels and so on in a Freudian context and with Freudian terminology. We'll hear what that is in a minute. Everything was sexual. The mother for the son, this one for that one, and so on. But I would always see it in terms of a religious essence. I would see it in terms of a religious impulse or some desire to understand God. I would write my papers in that context, and he would always say, the religious can also be interpreted as Freudian. So I didn't do very well in the course. I was mentioning this to the swami, and he said, your professor is correct. So now we've read enough of the books of Srila Prabhupada in translations. We've heard of the concept of Adi Ras. So Adi Ras, that is the original transcendental mellow that's experienced with the Supreme Lord in the form of Radha and Krishna. And then all of the loving relationships expand from that. So Freud, he was a German psychologist, psychoanalyst, and these were his theories. Freud asserts we are motivated by psychosexual forces. That means that whatever we're doing, even the Shastras say this, that the entire material world is based on sex desire. That's why we come here, from the microbes all the way up to Lord Brahma. Anyone who comes into the material world, it means that they have some separate desire, separate from their relationship with the Supreme Lord, and that is pervertedly manifested here in the material world as sex desire. There's also spiritual desire, Adi Ras. But in the material world, it's upside down. And we forget about our relationship with the Supreme Lord and attempt to have interpersonal relationships that are temporary and ultimately full of misery. Childhood experiences and unconscious motivations determine our adult thoughts and behaviors. So if anyone has ever gone to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a psychoanalyst, they will ask you, tell me about your childhood, because the impressions in our childhood form our personality in our adulthood, according to the Freudian theory. Now, the Vedic concept is a little different, because according to Krishna, there's the Asuric mentality and there's the Daivic mentality, the demons and the devotees. And one has these two different mentalities according to their activities. A demoniac person can become a devotee can also become demoniac according to their behavior. But according to Freud, everything is based on these childhood experiences, these desire for sexual pleasures to be fulfilled. We are captives of our biological and environmental forces. So nowadays, with genetic, they try to change things genetically with DNA and things like that. They've understood that 80% of our personality is created by our environment, what our experiences are. 20% is created by our DNA, by our biological factors. For instance, our physical, our hair color, our eye color, our skin color, that's all biological things. But there are also mental things that are carried on through our genes. Schizophrenia, paranoia, they have different names for these different concepts in psychology. So 20% comes from our biological factors. 80% of our personality is created by the environment in which we live. We learn the different moral codes, we learn the different social norms, we get an education, and whatever society we live in, that's the type of personality that we will develop. Now they're trying to change all of that. They're trying to break down the gender differences, that man, woman, in between, you can be whatever you want, you can change. So things are breaking down now, but each society has their different social laws, norms, morals, and that becomes 80% of our personality. The three personalities in a person are the id, the ego, and the superego. So this is also a little bit, we're getting to ego, that's the ahankar. So this is also in Vedic concepts, that there's the ahankar. But we have a false ahankar, and we have a real ego, or a real personality. The id is the deep unknown force inside us wanting pleasure. That's that animalistic desire for pleasure. Superego, the parental voice and values that govern thought. So this would be, we would understand that to be Paramatma, our conscience, trying to give us good advice, so to control the id, so that the id does not overcome all of these social norms that we have. And the ego is the mediating manager. So we have the example in Vedic concept of two birds on a tree. The one bird is trying to enjoy the different fruits on the tree. And the other bird, that's Krishna as super soul, Paramatma, he's just watching that bird, waiting for that bird to turn to him. So because these were, like with the experiments with truth, they didn't actually have the real truth, but they were creating these theories of psychology and psychiatry by their own experimental knowledge. And this particular teacher, Prabhupada said he is correct, that this whole world and all of our relationships are based on sex desire. And we understand that because when we come to a purified state, then we can have a loving relationship with Krishna, but not like what we're experiencing in the perverted form in this material world. I was surprised. I am going to an Indian swami, and he is saying that the professor was correct, that everything is based on sex and not religion. This kind of pulled the rug out from under me when he said that. Then he qualified what he'd said. He explained that in the material world, everyone is operating on the basis of sex. Everything that everyone is doing is being driven by the sex impulse. So, he said, Freud is correct. Everything is on the basis of sex in the material world. Then he clarified what material life is and what spiritual life is. In spiritual life, there is complete absence of sex desire. So this had a profound effect on me, especially because these young people who were taking intoxication, because intoxication, it increases the sensual experiences. So they were mixing sex with intoxication, with mystical experiences, thinking that it was a spiritual experience. But now Prabhupada is saying that spiritual life is completely devoid of any sex desire. So that means that all of these sexual desires that are present in the material world, when you become free from those desires, then you can experience spiritual life. He wasn't confirming my old sentimental ideas, but he was giving me new ideas. He was giving me his instructions, and I had to accept them. How could he not accept them? Because he didn't have the answers. Bruce didn't have the answers. None of the boys had the answers. And Prabhupada was giving them, he was clarifying everything about the difference between material life and spiritual life. Talking to the Swami was very nice. I found him completely natural, and I found him to be very artistic. The way he held his head, the way he enunciated his words, very dignified, very gentlemanly. So any person who his whole life had never broken the principles, had never, one time the doctor tried to get, when he was a little baby, tried to feed him chicken soup. When he had typhoid, he immediately threw it up. And that was probably Prabhupada wants to explain that in his previous life, he had once killed a snake. So this was as much sinful activity that Srila Prabhupada had ever engaged in. So when someone has lived such a pure life, all of their behavior, their mannerisms, the way they carry themselves, the way they speak, is so dignified and gentlemanly. And Bruce and the other boys had never seen a person like that, because in the American culture, the teachers are just as barbaric as the students. They engage in intoxication. Sometimes they'll even have illicit connection with their own students, so the student can get a good grade. It's terrible. They didn't see anyone of good character, even amongst the people that were supposed to be educating them. And now they have in front of them someone who was completely pure their whole life. The boys found Swamiji not only philosophical, but personal also. Steve. So this is a picture of Satsvarup Maharaj when he was quite young. A few nights later, I went to see the Swami and told him I was reading his book. Now, Steve was a writer. We heard that also a week or two ago, how even when he was in the Navy, he found an opportunity to write. He would keep a journal, he would write stories, poems. He was, by nature, a writer, and he identified. One thing that had especially caught my attention was a section where the author of Srimad Bhagavatam, Vyasadeva, was admitting that he was feeling despondent. Then his spiritual master Narada explained that his despondency had come because although he had written so many books, he had neglected to write in such a way as to fully glorify Krishna. After hearing this, Vyasadeva compiled the Srimad Bhagavatam. So this story is right in the first canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, which Prabhupada had given the boys in 3 parts. They purchased those books. Last week we read that Steve came from work and he wanted to buy the books during his lunch break. and the books were $18, but Steve gave Prabhupada $20, told him to keep the change. So as soon as he got the books, he started to read them, and very early in the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam is the story of when Vyasadeva is sitting despondently in his ashram, and his spiritual master, Narada Muni, comes and directs him that you've compiled, of course, the Vedas were always there, coming from Lord Brahma originally, that's the father of Narada Muni, but they weren't written down because in the previous ages, Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, the people were able to simply memorize by hearing. So there was no reason for written books. Now Vyasadeva, seeing that it was Dwapara Yuga, the end of Dwapara Yuga, seeing that Kali Yuga was arriving and people already had shortened memories, shortened lifespans, so he, along with the assistance of his different disciples, he began compiling the Vedic scriptures, writing them down. First the four Vedas, and then the different Shrutis, which were the Upanishads and the Agamas, the different sections. And each one of his disciples, he would give them sections of the Vedas that they had to become expert in to teach their disciples. So while compiling the Vedas, it had a lot of Upasana Kand, it had Jnana Kand, it had different sections for purification, Karma Kanda. If one wanted to attain the heavenly planets, the different types of karma they had to perform, the different types of worship they had to perform in order to attain different heavenly planets, such as the moon, the Chandralok, Suryalok, and all of these things, because while one is in the material world, it means they have material desires. So the Vedas would give elevating instructions how one can fulfill their material desires through the Vedic injunctions. So Vyasadeva had spent so much time writing these different khandas, the Upasana Kand, Karma Kand, Jnana Kand, for the benefit of uplifting or purifying the people on the planet. But he had failed to give the real essence of knowledge, which was to be put into the Srimad Bhagavatam after he had written the other 18 Puranas. So this is what Narada Muni came to tell Vyasadeva, and because Satsru Maharaj had been writing and did not feel fulfilled in his writing, he identified very much with Vyasadeva and his despondency. When I read this, I identified with the fact that Vyasadeva was a writer, because I considered myself a writer also, and I knew that I was also despondent. This was very interesting about the author, Vyasadeva, I said. He wrote so many books, but still he was not satisfied because he had not directly praised Krishna. Although I had very little understanding of Krishna consciousness, Swamiji opened his eyes very wide, surprised that I was speaking on such an elevated subject from the Srimad Bhagavatam. He seemed pleased. So immediately when Steve joined, he offered to assist Prabhupada. He was typing Prabhupada. We heard that Prabhupada showed him he had thousands of typed pages, and he wanted Steve to edit these, to retype them properly so that they could be published into books. So Steve took all of his literary capabilities and immediately started using them in Prabhupada's service, just like we heard that when Bruce walked through the courtyard, he saw a young man there just at a little picnic table, an outdoor wooden table. He was typing for Prabhupada also with great devotion. It's not mentioned who that young boy was because Bruce didn't know at the time, but anyone who had any capacity for typing, for editing, for writing, Prabhupada immediately engaged them in that service. Chuck, Achutananda. I had come by in the afternoon, and Swamiji had given me a plate of prasadam. So I was eating, and a chili burned my mouth, because they would make the chonk with the ghee, and they would throw in these big red dried chilies. We didn't have green chilies at that time. We only had the red ones. Very hot. Swamiji said, "Is it too hot?" "Yes," I said. So he brought me a tiny teacup with some milk. And then he took some rice off my plate and took a piece of banana and crushed it all up together with his fingers and said, "Here, eat this. It will kill the action of the chilies." So, of course, this is Ayurveda because one is Pitta dosh, the other is Kapha dosh. So Prabhupada took 3 Kapha dosh things. That's the milk, the rice, and the bananas. And that counteracted the Pitta dosh of the chili. So the boys were learning gradually. Bruce Brahmananda. There wasn't anything superficial about him. Nor was he ever contrived. That means artificial in what he was saying. Trying to make some impression. He was just completely himself. In the Swami's room, there was no furniture, so we sat on the floor. And I found this to be very attractive and simple. Everything was so authentic about him. Uptown, at another Swami's place, we had sat on big stuffed living room chairs, and the place had been lavishly furnished. But here was the downtown Swami, wearing simple cloth robes. He had no business suit on. He wasn't covering up a business suit with those saffron robes. And he wasn't affected as the other Swami was. So I found myself asking him if I could be his student. And he said yes. So we had, just in the very beginning of this book, Volume 2, we had read about when Prabhupada was alone, before he had any students, before he came to the Lower East Side. He had visited the Ramakrishna mission and different yogis who were already in India, such as Dr. Krishnamurti, Dr. Murti, Dr. Mishra, excuse me. And one of these swamis who had come to America in 1933, now it was 1966, his name was Swami Nikhilananda from the Ramakrishna mission, Vivekananda, the Vivekananda Society. And he had taken up Western life, smoking, meat eating, wearing a business suit. You see a picture here, his hair. Although he was a so-called sannyasi, he completely adopted American lifestyle so that the people would not feel intimidated by any differences. Now, Prabhupada, he did not compromise like that. Before he came to America, one of his godbrothers, who had been preaching in England, he offered to teach Prabhupada how to eat with a spoon and a fork, because nobody eats with their hands in the Western countries. It's considered barbaric. But Prabhupada, he said, no, I'm not going to accept these things. I'm coming to teach them the Vedic system. So Bruce had gone to Nikhilananda, and this is from his book Swamiji. Here, I'll read it. In July 1966, just before I met Srila Prabhupada, I said to Nikhilananda, I want to become your student. So he responded, okay, but I'm going on summer vacation now to St. Lawrence. We have an island there. When I come back to New York in September, you can become my disciple at that time. I was persistent, though, pushing him. Why don't you let me go with you? But he said, no. You won't like it there. Our main audiences consist of old ladies. That's our congregation. I guess I was among the first young hipsters to show appreciation for what he was doing. The rest were older, conservative people, and they were very westernized, as was he, in Western dress, and his center had an organ in a church-like atmosphere with pews. Pews are, you have pews in churches. It's long wooden seats where several people can sit on one chair. And that's the way people do their worship in the churches. They sit on these pews or these long chairs, and they sing hymns from the Bible. And there's an organ playing, just like we have mridanga, kartal, and harmonium sometimes. Although Bhaktivinoda Thakur did not allow harmonium because harmonium is not a Vedic instrument. The kartal and mridanga was only allowed by him. So Nikhilananda, he adopted what the Western people were accustomed to and simply added his philosophy of mishmash, hodgepodge, whatever the philosophy was. So the people who he attracted were these conservative elderly people, and they got a lot of their money from widows, wealthy widows. They would make donations so they could make these very opulent centers in the Western countries that were not at all the way Prabhupada developed his centers. So Bruce immediately saw the difference between the two different swamis and their different centers and the type of people that they were also teaching. And he was very attracted to Srila Prabhupada. Yes, they sang hymns and such. The only Indian thing there was the incense and his speeches. So this is I took this out of Brahmananda's book called Swamiji, because Satsrup Maharaj could not put all the details from all of the students in his book Prabhupada Lilamrita. This picture is Brahmananda here with Srila Prabhupada in his room at the time of the grand opening, which we'll be observing this year. Brahmananda was Prabhupada's secretary at that time. You can see it was quite hot then. He didn't even have his shirt on. And Prabhupada liked him very much as a secretary. Prabhupada would always try to keep Brahmananda near him. On one occasion, our conversation turned to my previous trip to India in 1962, and I began talking about how much it meant to me. Now, how much it moved me. I even mentioned that I had made a girlfriend there. So we got to talking about that, and I told him that I had her picture. I was carrying the girl's picture in my wallet. So Swamiji asked to see. I took out the picture, and Swamiji looked at it and made a sour face and said, "Oh, she's not pretty. Girls in India are more beautiful than that." Hearing that from the Swami just killed any attachment I had for that girl. I felt ashamed that I had an interest in a girl that the Swami did not consider pretty. I don't think I ever looked at the photograph again, and certainly I never gave her another thought. So Brahmananda, although he made so many devotees, he took sannyas very early in August of 1970. Prabhupada had him take sannyas then so they could preach all over the world. The first place he sent them was to East Pakistan, because Prabhupada, he was challenged that you've come here to India, it was when Prabhupada came back to India, and someone challenged him it's very easy to preach in India because everyone already knows about Krishna. Why don't you go preach in a difficult place like Pakistan? So then Prabhupada immediately called his two new sannyasis, Brahmananda and Gargamuni, and sent Brahmananda to East Pakistan and Gargamuni to West Pakistan to start preaching. And then the war broke out in 1971. Bruce was a newcomer and had only been to 1 week of meetings at the storefront. This is in August. In July, he had tried to become Nikhilananda's disciple, and that didn't happen. So now it was August when he met Prabhupada. So no one told him that the members of Ananda Ashram, Dr. Mishra's yoga retreat, had invited Swamiji and his followers for a day in the upstate countryside. So at this time, Dr. Mishra was not there. He had gone to Europe. And because Prabhupada had previously gone there in the weekends, he was invited there to lead the kirtans. So now they were inviting Prabhupada to come and also to bring his students. So because Bruce was new, he didn't know about the program. Bruce had just arrived at the storefront one morning when he heard someone announce, "The Swami is leaving." And Prabhupada came out of the building and stepped into a car. In a fit of anxiety, Bruce thought that the Swami was leaving them for good, for India. "No," Howard told him. Howard is Hayagriva. "We're going to a yoga ashram in the country." But the other car had already left, and there was no room in Swamiji's car. Just then, Steve showed up. He had expected the boys to come by his apartment to pick him up. They both had missed the ride. Here, Prabhupada's already in the car. Bruce phoned a friend up in the Bronx. So the way New York City is, it's in 5 different sections. There's Manhattan, and then above Manhattan is the Bronx, and then you cross the river, and on the other side of the river is Queens and Brooklyn, and then down in the harbor is a little island called Staten Island. So it's 5 different boroughs. So they were all the way down at the bottom of Manhattan, and the Bronx was all the way up here. But it was on the way to the ashram. So Bruce phoned a friend up in the Bronx and convinced him to drive them up to Ananda Ashram. But when they got to Bruce's friend's apartment, that means they would have had to take a subway. It would have taken about 1 hour to get from Lower East Side all the way up to the Bronx. The friend had decided he didn't want to go. Finally, he lent Bruce his car, and Swamiji's 2 new followers set out for Ananda Ashram. By the time they arrived, Prabhupada and his group were already taking prasadam, sitting around a picnic table beneath the trees. Ananda Ashram was a beautiful place with sloping hills and lots of trees and sky and green grass and a lake. Okay. Unfortunately, it's 6:30, so I'll stop here. And we have a lot to do. Let's see, this is only, I have 35 here. Next week, we're up to 18. So 18, there's still 17 more to go. Yes, so next week, Kusha Mataji, she will complete the next 17 slides, and you'll hear about Prabhupada's success of preaching there at the Ananda Ashram. Hare Krishna. Jai.